Correct. Okay. Good evening, everyone. We can call the meeting to order at 5:39 on April 4th, 2022. Sam, can we do roll call, please?
Sure. Commissioner Adam Lincoln, absent. Commissioner Alonso,
Here.
Commissioner Chavez,
Here.
Rivera,
Here.
Commissioner Kim Johnson, absent. Commissioner Leo Johnson,
Here.
Commissioner Killebrew,
Here.
Commissioner Rodriguez,
Here.
Commissioner Sanders, Commissioner Wood,
Here.
Vice Chair Zerette,
Here.
and Commissioner Reynell. You have.
Thank you, Sam. Moving on to public comment for items that are not on today's agenda. We have one public comment. Just your name and you have how
3 minutes.
3 minutes for your public comment.
My name is Nina.
Thank you. Which is information on will present the discuss the feedback this is incorporated into the city council. And today is research.
I have a really hard time hearing you guys. It keeps coming in and out. It's very like distorted. Is it my turn to go?
Yeah, it's your turn now.
Okay, all right. Now for some reason I can hear it. That's much better. All right, good evening, everybody. Let me share my screen.
Yeah.
All right, how does that look? You all can see that?
Yep.
Okay, do me a favor. I think I'm still having a hard time hearing you, but if you can hear me, maybe I'll just go straight through and then we can hopefully solve some of the sound issues on the back end. Would that be? Yeah, Rachel's saying yes, looks like. Okay, all right, cool. Okay. All right, so thank you all so much for having me tonight to join your meeting. And I'm excited to share with you the findings from this project, which I know you probably have been waiting on for quite some time. Before I get started, let me just give you a little background on the Center for Court Innovation and tell you a little bit about myself. And a quick, just a note about how I think it'll be best for us to move through, especially with the sound issues. What I'd like to do is just give the full presentation and then, you know, take notes, make notes about anything you'd like to follow up, and we can have a whole discussion on the back end if you have, you know, things were not clear, or if, you know, ultimately you'd like more information. And we can handle that in the follow-up discussion. Okay, so the Center for Court Innovation, for people who are not very familiar with us, we're a nonprofit organization. We're located in New York City. We've been around for 25 years. We just had our 25th anniversary, and we started with about, I don't know, maybe 20 employees, and now we have over 800. We do three primary things. We create programs to test new ideas and solve problems. We perform original research, looking at what works and what doesn't. And we provide expert assistance to justice reformers around the world. And so when I talk about programs, a lot of what I'm talking about here are court-based reforms or systems-based reforms. So we run problem-solving courts, things like drug courts, mental health courts, community courts. We have a wide variety of alternatives to incarceration programming, community-based programming. It really runs the gamut. But the approach that we always take And all of that work is that we work with systems to try to figure out what is data-based, what is most effective, and what will increase public safety, efficiency, and ultimately trust in the system. The research that we do is kind of in two camps. So some of the work supports those programs, like metrics and dashboards and things like that to help them track what their participants are doing and whether their programs are effective. And then there's another whole branch, which is what I primarily do, that is nationally focused work. And so that can be large projects, whether it's multi-site studies, large evaluations funded by the federal government of various programs that, let's say, the National Institute of Justice wants to assess for efficacy. It also can be smaller programs like this or projects like this, where we're really just looking to paint more of a portrait of something that is going on. I have been with the Center for 15 years. I started not in research at all, actually running a community organizing program for young people who lived in Brooklyn's largest public housing development. And over time, my work has really I've done a lot of different things. I've done a lot of work with criminal justice legal system stakeholders. So I was the deputy director at New York City's largest criminal arraignment court. I've run alternative to incarceration programs. And then in terms of research, a lot of my stuff is exploratory, which means that, we're looking to really understand processes, how things happen, how people who live experiences feel them, and what their kind of frameworks are. But I've also done all sorts of evaluations of, court-based projects and community-based programs as well. So I'm happy to answer questions about any of that at the back end if you have more interest. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what the scope of work for this project was. So the center was brought on in the fall of last year with the intention to collect community feedback for your recommendations. As I mentioned, so I talked a little bit about exploratory research. When we talk about that, what we're really saying is that we're not here to test a specific hypothesis. We're not doing evaluation. We're really just trying to collect information about a topic. And often we do that when we don't have a lot of other existing data. It's sort of a first step of a longer process. Another thing that I'll say is that when we're designing research, we take a lot of things into consideration. So we look at the goals, right? So your goal is collecting community feedback. We look at available time, we look at the available resources, and then we look at the people power, because all that influences how we design the study. All right, so how did it play out for you? For this project, they had two real components. The first piece was a focus group. There were 8 of these, they were 90 minutes each. They were held from February 23rd to February 25th. 6 of them were in person at Santa Barbara Public Library. So 5 of them were there. 1 was at Alameda Park. 2 were done online via Zoom, and translation services were available upon request for those, although that was not used. 56 people total participated in those focus groups. The survey was the second piece, which you all, I believe you've all vetted all of this, but as you will remember, that was a 17-item instrument with 7 additional demographic questions at the end. Surveys were collected between March 3rd and March 23rd, so it was a 20-day period. It took less than 10 minutes to complete, and paper copies were available online. No, paper copies were available at City Hall and community events, and then it was widely distributed online. Right, and so the thing that I'll just remind you here is that we're trying to create a mechanism for as much public feedback as we can get on the commission's draft recommendations. So in what follows, I'm going to be reporting on trends and responses for the almost 1,100 people who participated in the study, and what we saw in those responses. Just a quick, whenever we do studies, as I mentioned, we have all these different factors that we have to take into consideration, and there are always limitations to the work. So for this project, there were 3 primary limitations for us from a research perspective that we would consider limitations. 1, time constraints meant that survey and focus group data collection took place in 1 month. So that's a pretty short period of time. The second limitation is that the budget precluded the possibility of obtaining a probability sample that would have been representative of Santa Barbara residents as a whole, right? So I mentioned, but we can talk about the 1,100 that we had. Depending on their different sampling methods we could use that could potentially give us the ability to extrapolate out to the wider population of the city. But those are actually quite expensive to do, and the budget did not allow for that. The third piece is that the survey could only be completed in English or Spanish. And so if there were other folks local whose primary language was something else, they would not be represented in this data. Okay, so for survey respondents, I'm gonna talk about, I can give you some demographic information here. I will say, I'm gonna put a pin in this because this is not, I can't give you like definitive answers about your sample. So the way that this section was structured, the commission felt it was important to be able to give people as many options as possible to, express sort of the fullness of their identity and how they think about themselves and how they identify. So we can structure things differently in surveys. This is actually, it's not specific to this project. This is sort of a survey design issue. So when you try to give people more options, kind of let them self-define out of the box, you then on the back end have a little bit of difficulty putting them back into categorical boxes, right? So if people can select all, it's very difficult to tell what your total sample looks like. So what I can say here is that I can give you how many people selected these categories of your 1,040, but I can't tell you that definitively 45%, for instance. Let's take this right here. So this 45%, I can't tell you that 45% of the sample was female. I can say 45% of the sample elected to identify as female. So I hope that distinction makes sense. But here we have, so 45% of the sample identified as female, 27% male, 4% identified as cisgender, and less than 1% each identified as non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, or transgender. Dropping down to race and ethnicity, 55% chose to identify as white, 11% identified as Hispanic or Latino, Latinx, 4% Asian Pacific Islander, 3% Black or African American, 2% Indigenous. On sexual orientation, 9% identified as heterosexual, 4% bisexual, pansexual, 2% gay, 1% lesbian. In terms of other identities, 11% chose to identify themselves as victims or former victims of crime, 9% as students, 8% personally impacted by the criminal justice system, and then 5% or less for each of the categories of veteran, immigrant, individual living with a disability, current or former law enforcement officer or employee, and currently or formerly homeless. And so just as a reminder, also these demographic questions were put at the end of the survey. They were optional. And so, some people chose not to answer any, some people kind of skipped certain questions. And that is why the numbers are not quite as concrete as they might have been. Also asked was neighborhood where folks worked or resided, and people could choose up to 3. So you can see 18% of the sample identified downtown as one of these neighborhoods, 12% Goleta, 9% East Side, 7% each for West Side, San Roque, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, Nolita, and so on. I won't read all of them, but you can see them listed here, and it will be provided for you in the final memo. But there are a lot of neighborhoods represented, and I think this is true, that all of those listed out had at least some representation. Okay, now this is a little bit more concrete in the sense that this was a select one only question. So of the respondents, so 800, you can see 835 people of the 1,040 answer this question. But of those, 81% reported that they had never attempted to file a complaint, considered filing a complaint alleging misconduct with Santa Barbara Police Department, or filed a complaint. Another 10% on top of that did not know that a process was available. So this tells us that a large portion of the sample does not have direct experience with the complaint, the current and existing complaint review process. The last piece that I'll add is that the average age for survey respondents was 51. And that is a number, that it's a concrete number. Okay, so let's move on to some of the findings. And before I really get into this, I will add the timing and sort of the timeline of how you had requested this rolled out meant that this presentation was preliminary findings. And so there may be there's quite a bit more that I will provide to you tomorrow in the memo. And so there may be things that I don't touch on here that in the question and answer period, if you have questions, you can ask about those and I may be able to give you something more concrete tonight. Okay, membership. So we asked a number of questions regarding the composition of the Civilian Oversight Board. And I will say, in terms of, so there was in the survey, the last question wasn't like an open comment field. And so there were a lot of comments listed in there. And the question of prior law enforcement was one of the most commented on. So there's a lot more data that I have on this that I can share. But as you can see, 42% of the sample said yes, individuals with prior law enforcement experience should be eligible to serve on the Civilian Oversight Board. An additional 23% said yes, but only after a period out of law enforcement. And so this over here is just a breakout of those 23%, their responses and what they indicated they thought the appropriate wait time would be. And you can see that about 75% of them indicate between 2 and 5 years is an appropriate, in their minds, an appropriate waiting time. So a little bit of context here for some of those answers. So overall, focus groups suggest that at base, people really see the importance of having deep knowledge of the complexities of policing, particularly use of force, but have some concerns about the ability of law enforcement to be neutral or unbiased, particularly given the size of Santa Barbara. So that came out in the focus group data and then also in a lot of the open-ended survey responses. So for those people who said that they thought including law enforcement was important and essential, right? There's no problems. There was sort of that first bucket. They listed 2 primary reasons for that. One is that exclusion sends a signal that the board is in some way against law enforcement. And so ultimately they said it's going to work against securing buy-in among Santa Barbara Police Department. The other major point that they hit is that there is a lot of specialized knowledge that people have through the lived experience of serving as a police officer or serving in law enforcement. And as you can see here, this focus group participant said the gap in knowledge is so big, even people with 6+ months of police training struggle with how to use force. And so they really question how people who have no lived experience with it would be able to do so, given how complex it is for those in law enforcement. Then, okay, so that's sort of the first bucket. The second bucket of people are those who really believe or really endorse the importance of having law enforcement, at least that perspective, weigh in on any sort of, the duties of the Civilian Oversight Board, but felt that some sort of limitation or some container needed to be created around that. So some of the suggestions there were imposing limits on involvement, including screening, some sort of screening process through the, application process, bringing in people who had law enforcement experience outside of the Santa Barbara Police Department, reserving only 1 or 2 positions for folks with prior law enforcement experience, or creating some sort of non-voting board role for people with prior law enforcement experience. As you can see, a lot of that was tied to, the the desire to limit it in some way was tied to the desire to preserve the independence, or even just the perception of independence of the board. So this person says, I think having individuals with some perspective of law enforcement is important. I think police officers have a difficult job. There are different ways to communicate that experience, like perhaps in a liaison role, other than being on the committee, if it's to be independent. Okay, and then the third primary bucket, in terms of responses to this question, were people who were concerned about the ability of people with law enforcement connections to be neutral. This person says, it would not feel good to walk into a local restaurant and see an officer meeting with the police chief while serving on the board. Even if they're not talking about anything, it would raise a flag for me. We function as a small community and people know each other and call the chief of police by his first name. The appearance of conflict of interest is something to mitigate. So for a lot of folks, even, they were concerned about this, even though they did not suggest that there would be anything untoward, just that they felt that the appearance was something to guard against. So if you remember, about 65% of survey respondents indicated support for prior law enforcement presence on the board. Almost the inverse is the case for family members of current Santa Barbara Police Department employees. 68% of people said that they did not support this. And it's interesting because in the focus groups and the survey, the sort of open responses, there really wasn't a lot to shine more light on this, to provide context for this. So what we do have indicates that, people who saw potential challenges around neutrality for people with prior law enforcement experience, that the same thing might hold true for family members. But they would not have some of the subject matter expertise that people with their own personal law enforcement experience would bring. So this person says, I think there is a lot of overlap and personal connections of having family members affiliated with the Santa Barbara Police Department serving on the Oversight Board. This may create a conflict. There was broad support for diverse community representation on the board. 84% of the survey respondents felt the board should represent the diversity of Santa Barbara. There was a cohort of responses that came through the surveys where people questioned how diverse Santa Barbara really was, but said that they would not, and a couple of people said, we wouldn't want this to be tethered to like the census, but that there should be diversity, racial, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender status, all these different things, there should be representation. So people, just as people thought that lived experience was important for law enforcement, like that perspective, people also felt that was important here, and intentionally selecting members from communities with historically challenging relationships with police. So the first respondent says, I think Police Oversight Commission should lean more heavily to more minority members and other underserved communities, since they are usually more adversely impacted by poor policing and poor police policies. Another focus group participant said, in addition to qualifications, members should have some sort of experience as a disparities subgroup that has negative experiences with police departments and could shine light on how to do it better. Since some of these are listed out, people with mental health issues, LGBT, minority statuses, whether that's women, Latinx, African-American, Black, Asian, people with disabilities separate from the mental health category, having people who can speak to their experiences and members of cultural subgroups would be beneficial. And so additional communities that were brought up that folks suggested might be represented were community members who were unhoused or people who were formerly incarcerated. And I will also note that this desire for diversity, and it didn't come out for this presentation, but it did in the memo, so it'll be in there, was a driving force for inclusion of people with prior law enforcement experience. So that the conception of diversity also, a lot of people said, if we're going to be inclusive, then we have to include everybody. Okay. So in terms of membership, Really across the board, there was support for having clear processes for selecting and for removing members. So how are we selecting and then bringing people on? And then how would we go about, or when would we go about removing them if there was some sort of an issue? So there was concern on all sides about potential bias of the board. People would say for it to work effectively, it must be shielded from influence by the police department and its stakeholders. Likewise, it must be shielded from influence both from those who do not support law enforcement. So people see the possibility for that bias to come, I guess, in multiple different directions. Survey respondents and focus group participants all supported a clear process for selecting and removing members. And so some of the things that were brought up as things to consider included screening for bias, transparent public interview process, ensuring those with prior law enforcement experience had, this is like a quote, a clean record, but clean record, annual review for members, and clear expectations around things like confidentiality, ethics, and neutrality. And social media actually came up a number of times in terms of whether having, making certain claims or representations online would be grounds for removal. I can say a lot more about the training if you would like in the question and answer period or the discussion period, but there was a lot of support for robust training, for making training mandatory, but there was concern as well for the sort of potentially disproportionate effect of the amount of time that would take for people in lower income brackets or for people who had less access to resources. And so support for compensation was came out in the focus groups and some of the survey responses as being kind of tethered to the training, the training asks, in addition to the other duties of the board. So you can see there was mixed responses to compensation, but more than half said that they either agreed or strongly agreed. This is of survey responses, that board members should be compensated. And almost the same amount said that the amount outlined in the draft recommendations was appropriate. A lot of people, I will say, did mention, and it's unclear, we could potentially tell you this, but it would take some time to get this breakdown. I don't know whether they agreed or disagreed, but a lot of people did mention that it should be consistent with whatever practices across other city commissions and boards. Okay, so now moving on to Office of Police Oversight. All right, so 64% of respondents agreed that the Office of Police Oversight should be able to accept these complaints directly and anonymously. 26% disagreed, and 10% said that they were unsure. So it's about 2/3 agreed. Responses to the question of whether people with previous law enforcement experience should be allowed to serve as the director of police oversight were more mixed. 43% agreed, 36% disagreed, and 21% were unsure. All right, so now we'll look at the effects of civilian oversight on perceptions of policing and the complaint review process. All right, so first we wanted to know how respondents felt about the existing Sbpd internal investigation process. So the survey asked whether people believe that the Sbpd is transparent about its existing internal investigation process and if they trust the outcomes of that process. So we can see here, I grouped this just for ease, about 30% say that they believe that the process that exists, Sbpd, is transparent about the current process. 27% disagree, 43% say they don't know much about the process. 37% say they agree, agreed that they trust the outcomes of the existing internal investigation process. 29% disagree. 35% don't know much about the process. So there's pretty even distribution here between agreeing, disagreeing, and not really knowing much. If Santa Barbara had an Office of Police Oversight, so this is a question, if Santa Barbara had an Office of Police Oversight that could receive and monitor complaints about alleged Sbpd misconduct and make public reports, respondents' trust in the complaint process, 50% said it would increase, 16% said it would decrease, 21% said it would stay the same, 13% unfamiliar with the process. 56% said that the sense of transparency or the transparency of the complaint process would increase. 11% said it would decrease. 21% said it would stay the same. 13% said they were unfamiliar with the process. So you're going to see there's like a lot of consistency across these numbers, but this is about 20% higher than perceptions of the existing process. So if you see, we can compare that with 37 and 30%. Expanding now, so beyond just Office of Police Oversight, expanding to civilian oversight more broadly. If Santa Barbara had a civilian oversight process as described, so there was a whole description at the top part of the survey. Respondents said trust in community policing and policing in their communities, would increase 56%. 14% said it would decrease. 31% said it would stay the same. 60% said their belief in the transparency of Sbpd would increase. 12% said it would decrease. 28% said it would stay the same. So we see those increases of about 20% holding here as well. And then lastly, we asked about accountability to the community. 62% said that if Santa Barbara had a civilian oversight process as described, their perception of the accountability to the community would increase. 10% said it would decrease. 28% said it would stay the same. Okay. There were a number of places where participants were kind of confused or wanted more clarity. And unfortunately, some of these overlapped with places where I know you were hoping people would weigh in. And I can talk about that also a little more in a minute. But one of the areas that a lot of people expressed wanting more on was a baseline description of the problem, meaning how much is the creation of the civilian oversight process a reaction to local issues versus national issues. It came out in a number of different areas and on a number of different topics. So it's not really specifically tethered to one, domain on the survey or in the focus group protocol. People described wanting clarity around a process of deciding the size and composition of the Civilian Oversight Board, meaning they wanted commitment to goals and the mandate of the COB, qualifications, lived experience, special effort to include those who might be scared to speak up or get involved. There was also some discussion of, as I said before, this compensation. So are other commissioners and committee members compensated? I think some folks felt unable to weigh in on this issue because they just didn't know if this was standard or not. A big one was levels of authority. So this was, I think, the most, aside from, here, let me say this. So this was the most commented on sort of issue in the survey responses, the open survey field. This was another big one, both in focus groups and in the survey. People were unclear about levels of authority and the oversight between Civilian Oversight Board, Office of Police Oversight, Santa Barbara Police Department. There was also some confusion about what the oversight boards would be relative to the city council. And I think people on all sides of the issue were concerned about power, authority, whether recommendations made there was any sort of like implementation, I guess, power behind them, as well as many folks who felt that there was overreach of these entities and that it would potentially have an impact on retention in the police department. There were questions, this is kind of related, but you know, some people would say, well, who has oversight of these entities? So that, I think that's an area where you know, your respondents were requesting some clarity, as well as specific details of the complaint process. So, and this is something that came up as something that they were hoping the either or both entities could, you know, make clearer, is what exactly the complaint process looked like, what you needed to make a complaint, and if there could be some sort of visibility for a complaint made. So if, as this person says, if I make a complaint, how do I know where it's at? Like, is it in a review process? That kind of thing. Okay, so I think I will stop there. It's about 30 minutes and I did give you a lot, but I know you will probably also have other things you want to ask me. In terms of next steps, we're going to be getting to you tomorrow, a memo that is right now about 12 pages, single spaced. It's pretty comprehensive. We also have, there's some other pieces that I'm happy to talk about here or elsewhere that could be provided. And I don't know, Gabe, if you want to talk about next steps past that.
Thank you, Elise. I just want to take a moment to thank you for all of your hard work. This is a big lift and you did a big portion of this. I want to highlight your great work and you've been a great part. And really excited to see the memo. But for now, we'll turn it back to the commission for any, well, I guess public comment would be first, correct?
Sure. Anybody in the public?
So it doesn't look like we have any public comment. Are there any questions from the commission for Elise about the presentation or any information they're curious about? Might in the memo, but not in today's presentation.
You can speak up so she can hear.
Elise, I'm wondering if it's possible to get not a copy of the individual surveys, but a copy of all the comments that were made and specifically the notes in the focus groups. I like your summary and thank you for doing the work. But I'd like to see, because I was hearing a couple times a lot, like the term a lot, and I'm curious to know how many constituted a lot, and just other notes that would probably be really interesting. So I'm wondering if you can add that to the like an addendum to the notes, or no?
So the plan, what we had planned to do, yeah, in terms of your question of the raw data. So I wasn't sure. It doesn't sound like you want the SBSS data set.
No, I
right?
don't. Because you've done a great job breaking down the demographic information. I'm more concerned about what did they actually say?
Sure.
What were the
so I have, we have for you all a 28-page document that lays out the all of the survey data and then groups the survey responses by theme. And so our job as the people who do both the quantitative and the qualitative analysis is to go through and identify what the major themes are and then group. So what we will never do is provide totals, right? We're not going to say it's 800, I can't say here, but 45 people said this particular thing. So it's when it surfaces frequently or somewhat. We're just trying to represent what different sort of pockets of response category are. And that is largely to provide some context for the numbers, right? To provide some context. So yes, so that will provide you, so there is a little bit of, so there's some grouping, and then there is also some, like a little bit of analysis on it. So depending on how deep people want to go in that. I am not going to be able to provide the focus group notes by tomorrow. That's not something that I can do. I have some travel that I have to do. So my hope for you is that and you can tell me what you think, that the memo, once you see that and you have all of the comments from the survey responses, that will give you a lot of data. That's a lot of data to work with.
Thank you for that. If we, for any reason, wanted more of the focus group, because that's where a lot of the great, I think, comments would come from, would you be able to provide that for next Wednesday's meeting?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. Let me, I'll have to look at my, it's some formatting, but yeah, let me look at my workload and let me talk to Rachel. Yeah. And why don't you take a look at what I send tomorrow, and you can let me know if you still like that.
Great. Thanks, Elise.
Sure.
Thank you, Lizzie. Rich?
So is there any breakdown between what was seen in the focus group data versus the survey data? Is that separated out at all?
It's not separated out in terms of analysis. We just haven't had time to do that. We do have, as I said, you'll be able to see with what I provide tomorrow, as close to the raw survey response data as you can get, and then you can kind of compare that. We would need more time if what you were looking for is a comparison, like a very detailed comparison of focus group responses versus survey responses.
Thank you.
Sure.
Curious, because did any of the focus group participants take, or is part of the analysis correlating comment to the 17?
No.
Did you
I think what you said was, oh, there's a lot of feedback. I think what you were asking, Rachel, is did we do any analysis looking at trying to do a one-to-one match of survey response to focus group
did the
commentary?
Take the survey.
She's asking, did this group?
I don't know. I don't know. The surveys are anonymous.
Okay, but at the focus groups, they weren't also handed.
I did not personally conduct the focus group, so I think that might be something that Cami could weigh in on.
The survey was not ready to go when we did the focus group.
That's right. That's right.
Is there, because I think Commissioner Sander brings up a really interesting point. Is there a meaningful or statistical difference between a focus group and a survey, or is it routine in this type of work to view the data in aggregate?
We would almost always view it in aggregate. I mean, the standard practice is typically you have a survey that provides you with the larger number, right? So you can speak to you have more participants, you have a greater number there, and then you look to flesh out what you see in the numbers. I mean, I can go back. I guess I should stop sharing this, but we would just look through all of the focus group data, and we would look through the surveys to find things that were related or that might give us some insight into what these numbers might mean or could mean for people.
Can I speak?
Yeah.
So I think what I'm curious about is that I thought that we were very specific with focus groups in terms of finding different populations that would speak to the survey and one control how many people take the survey. For the focus groups, I would get opinions a little higher because of the you were saying. So I am curious if there's a means to explore the two.
You really cut out on that one. I'm so sorry.
So what I'm asking is, because the focus groups were targeted to specific populations, and that we didn't really know exactly who this was to, whether or not it would be possible to kind of disaggregate it so that we could see what focus group information was, because we may weigh that a little bit heavier than the general survey.
So as part of the focus group protocol, we did not ask people to go around and identify what their affiliations were. And so I know there were 2 specific law enforcement focus groups. And then beyond that, they were kind of combined due to people's schedules. So I can tell you, if you would like, if that's what you're asking, is that what you'd like to know?
I'm just curious. Like, I think that's interesting, right? Because 2 enforcement specific groups weigh pretty heavy on the law enforcement side versus the 4 other groups that we attempted to target for focus groups. And I think that's interesting data compared to what is the larger amount of data that just went out there. So I'm wondering, I'm just curious to see what that focus group data said, because it seems like that could be weighted in one way versus the total aggregate data. So
yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is for your consideration, it would be helpful, or you might like to know what some groups said specifically. Is that? We would not, in research, we wouldn't weight one more than another necessarily, unless we wouldn't necessarily weight one over another. They're just different kinds of data. I don't know. I feel like I'm not answering the question.
If I may,
yeah.
We know if this gets your point. Versus what comes from the survey.
I'm so sorry, you cut. There was like a glitchy. So I got something that comes from the survey, and then what from the focus groups?
Wait, from your memo, is it clear the information?
Yeah, so in the memo, it will say focus group respondents or focus group participant said such and such, survey respondent said such and such, and then there's the data, the numbers.
Okay.
But it is organized right now, like more or less like the presentation that you just saw. So it's not analyzed, the focus groups separately, and then survey data separately. Because typically, and I guess maybe we should have clarified that, but typically when we do studies like this, we put the data side by side, or we combine it.
Thank you.
Different than the survey questions, so that they were more open-ended and so you won't get those clear of this is.
I'm sorry, I can't hear. I can't tell. Do you want me to leave and come back in? Do you think that would solve the audio problem?
Let's take a 5-minute break to try and fix the audio issue.
Okay.
I'm having the same problem you are, Elise.
Okay.
So it seems to be the more directly people are talking into the middle of the table, the easier it is to hear them. But I don't know if that's actually true or not.
Yeah, and the closer
that's just
maybe
my
to
best
us.
guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're gonna take 5 minutes. All right, we'll call this meeting back over at 6:33. And we're still in the questions period from the commission. Any other questions?
I had a question. So when will this information be provided for the public or for like the community?
All right, thanks.
Tomorrow.
Once we get the memo, then
okay.
In English tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
As
Okay.
soon as we get it in English, we can start the translation.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. And then the recording too, when is that going?
probably a day.
Okay.
No. Other questions?
So I think we had left off on discussing the distinction between the focus group process and the survey process. They were not identical surveys, right? I think that's what Commissioner Rodriguez was explaining before we recessed.
Lizzie, did you want to give that now that Elise and
Sure, and then the survey group can correct me or fill in, but the survey questions were more open-ended questions to help participants really explore and have dialogue around this topic or the different themes, while the survey was closed-ended questions and very specific. So if you're to separate or delineate the two, you won't get exact answers.
Sure. I still think that the survey data versus the focus group data could be interesting to analyze in different capacities.
Elise, that'll come through. One of the questions I had asked was, will that come through in the memo and be clear about what's coming from the focus group conversations versus the survey data? Memo?
Yeah, I mean, so you'll be able to see, it will be clear what is coming from where. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Other questions?
Question, so there was mention about confusion. Was that confusion mostly, did it just show up in the focus groups?
In the focus groups and in the open-ended survey question. Yeah.
So Elise, this is I guess this is more asking your opinion more than specific data, but one of the things that that was brought up or brought to me by a community member was that we didn't define law enforcement. And so for some folks, they felt maybe law enforcement was very specific to police or sheriff, where others may see law enforcement to include the DA's office, probation, and so forth. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the specific questions, because it seemed like there was just such a change between should law enforcement or former law enforcement be allowed on the commission versus family members of current law enforcement. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that particular community concern.
So that issue did come up in both focus group a few people brought that up in the focus groups and then in the survey responses as well. What is law enforcement? What is the definition? Do people who have arresting power count as law enforcement? So it seems to me that clarity on that would be beneficial. In terms of, what was the second part of your question? Because I did have a thought on it.
I just noticed that there was such a difference between the support of current law enforcement versus support of former law enforcement versus family of current. And I'm just wondering if that vagueness or that lack of clarity, just in your opinion, do you think it may have influenced the answers?
I don't know. I mean, so the researcher in me says we don't have enough data to make a determination on that. I think in the focus groups, for many of them, there was not much time spent on the family member question, and it did not come up. This is what I was trying to say earlier. There's just not a lot on that to flesh out what the concern there was. And so what there is looks to me like people saying there's still the potential for bias without the expertise. And so, and the size of the community means that like former or prior law enforcement may be from other jurisdictions, it may be other cities, it may be, there are a lot of different ways or places that people might have served in that capacity that would not be necessarily be the Santa Barbara Police Department.
Thank you.
And on that, just for clarity, it did seem that from some of the focus group responses, it said that it would be beneficial to have former law enforcement to act as a liaison, but we didn't clarify that there would be a liaison no matter what, correct?
Can you say more about we meaning that?
Yeah, I mean, I can help answer that.
Okay.
In the survey itself, we did not. If they read the recommendations, like if they actually linked to the document, it is in our draft recommendations. Yeah. But in the explanatory, very reduced explanatory text in the survey form, they would not have seen.
Gotcha. I just thought that was interesting because if people brought up, we're really looking for someone to have some sort of law experience, and then they bring up only one or two people, it seems that if we have a liaison, that would meet that requirement.
Yeah.
Question? I got a bunch.
Yeah.
So I just want to start by highlighting some really interesting things that I took away from this. So, but before I do that, I do want to acknowledge the limitations of getting out a survey like this. Like we saw, other folks that speak languages other than English and Spanish were not included, so we didn't get that perspective. We saw overwhelmingly 55% white, right? We saw 45% that identified as female, right? And you talked about the distinction between, we can say that 45% are female, but that 45% identify. And so there, I want to acknowledge the limitations of the survey results, but here's some really interesting takeaways that I'm really excited about. It appears that a majority of those who we surveyed believe that the recommendations as we have proposed them, right, without further work, which we are going to do based on the results of this survey, but it would appear that a majority of those surveyed believe that the recommendations as proposed right now would increase trust and transparency in the complaint process. They would increase trust and transparency in policing in the community, and they would increase accountability. So that, to me, makes me feel really good about the place and the model that we have proposed for our recommendations. I do want to talk about one of the more contentious provisions of our recommendations. We've been split on this as a board, and I think it's worthy of discussion because we need to incorporate this feedback into the final recommendations to City Council, and that is regarding the composition of the Civilian Oversight Board and the current exclusion of folks with law enforcement experience. So in the survey, 42% of the respondents said that they support law enforcement being able to be on the board without restrictions. Although I don't know that that's the takeaway that we could have from the way that the survey was worded. but that's kind of how my takeaway based on the other options that were available. But 58% were either skeptical or unsure of how law enforcement should be on or compose part of the Civilian Oversight Board. And so maybe we could go back to that slide, Elise, and just and chat about
sure.
the findings here.
Give me just a sec. This one right here?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you like me to would you like me to chat, or is it, are there specific questions?
Could you do me a favor and maybe recap the information, and then very specifically I want to ask about the recommendations from the survey respondents on how much time a law enforcement officer should have been out of law enforcement to serve. And then I would like to ask Lieutenant Hill and Cammie their opinion on this data and what you think about a recommendation for this period of time, which I think we've talked about in the past is arbitrary, but I think it's really interesting. Why are 43% of people saying 5 years? Is that meaningful? And go from there. So maybe if you could just start by recapping the information.
Sure. So 42% of people said that individuals who have prior law enforcement experience should be able to serve on the board. 23% said yes, but only after a period out of law enforcement. And then, and just some, a little context for the question, then if they answered yes to that piece, they selected that option, then a drop-down menu was there. And so they were able to select 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 to 10, or 10 plus. And so that's where that came from. Now, based on some of what I went over earlier, I think there is clearly support for 42%, 65% of people say, yes, there is a role, but this is what this context slide is trying to get at there. And I can't give you the breakdown, and I think you probably might want it, but in terms of, here, let me get the little pointer thing. How many people of those 42 versus 23 fall into this camp versus this? So there is nuance to this. So they're the people who say, law enforcement is part of this community. People who are retired from the force or out of the police force in some capacity are civilians at that point. They should be able to be part. This is cutting against diversity, etc. Then there are people who are kind of, if you think of it like the continuum, appear to be somewhere in the middle, who are saying things like, yes, this perspective is important, the knowledge is important, the expertise is important, but I can, they'll say, as this quote indicates, things like, I see that there is potential for bias, or the board wants to be independent or should be independent, and if that is a purpose of it, perhaps a non-voting role would be important. So people just looking at many different sides, I think, of this issue. So I don't know if that clarifies, or is
no,
provides you
I'm
with.
I'm glad to hear that there was a lot of nuance in the survey response as well, because it matches our own deliberations about this issue. That's helpful. But I am curious, so I think that there's, initially when we wrote the position, it was to have, Chair, correct me if I'm incorrect, but it was one position, 7 years, and a laundry list of things like not a current or former Sbpd officer, not sheriff in the county. We talked a lot about, like, what about CHP officers? What about Ventura or SLO or coordinating jurisdictions? So there's this, to me, there's a compromise, like, hanging out there to say there's these conditions and for one position without saying that you have to fill that position, right? But one position could be for law enforcement. And so I want to just hear, I know we've talked about this a lot, but now we have new data about what people feel about it. So I would love to hear what some of the other commissioners think. But before that, I would love to hear from Cammie and also from Lieutenant Hill on, like, if it was a number of years, because it seems like the overwhelming majority say 5 years plus. Like, is that a meaningful distinction? Is there, like, a best practices for what that should look like in terms of exclusion of folks who have been out for 5 years versus 3 years?
Thank you, Commissioner Alonso. Can you hear me okay, Elise and Cammie?
Yes.
This is Sean Hill. I'm assigned staff to support the CFC. I work for the police department. To respond to Commissioner Alonso and the commission, I think I would start by saying Elise, I also read it the way you did, that 65% said yes, with 23% qualifying their yes with the time frame. And I think we've spoken to, it's our department position that in the spirit and functional application of being inclusive, we believe there should be opportunity for law enforcement on the board, whether they secondary conversation. But regarding the time frame, I know that it's been discussed quite a bit in meetings that have been public, and they have been exposed to that. So the 5 years, I guess it could be just exposure to the conversation that the commission has had, because it's been explored extensively, like you mentioned. I can give you a little bit of maybe my idea about the 5 years, and it probably makes some sense. Time and space is important. I support that completely. And it is true that people will come into the police department, just like any other organization, at about the same time and have kind of close cohorts. Maybe they go to the academy together or something like that. And those people do generally phase out and retire about the same time. So, that 3 or 2 to 5 years probably makes some sense in the sense that, a lot of the perceived conflict with close relationships might be addressed by time frame suggested in the survey. That's probably as much as I can speak to that, but it does make sense to me, at least anecdotally, that especially because of the concern about optics and relationships, a lot of people who come into the department together also come of retirement age within the that few years. It does make some sense, although I can't really scientifically support that. That helps a little bit. And I also just want to say out loud, and I think that's been discussed, that everyone on the board will have bias, right? Everyone has bias for sure, and it's just the point of neutrality that I think.
I have a quick clarifying. It's kind of for Elise, but so the 42% yes, 23% yes with qualifications. Elise, is what you were saying before that part of that 42% though might have what the next slide says?
It's possible. Mm-hmm.
I just want to know what we can really claim. Like, is it 42, yes, 1,000% with no restrictions? Or is some of that 42% potentially the same, but maybe with this or this or this that's on the next slide?
Yeah, I mean, I really can't tell you that at this point. If that is analysis that you wanted us to do, we could potentially pull, survey responses. We might be able to do that, pull survey responses and then match to
I just want to make sure we're not saying or over-claiming like certain answers, I guess.
I mean, all I can do is tell you this is how they responded to that question.
To add to that conversation. That would be specific to Sbpd former law enforcement, but what about non-Sbpd former law enforcement? So sheriff's office that wouldn't have a personal relationship or may not have a personal relationship with the department, or probation officer from the county. So I think those are. I would like to think that our city council would now and in the future would be respectful of the intention of this agency and think about and consider those things.
Just for point of clarification, I thought that the survey actually just said law enforcement, not specifically Sbpd. Can you clarify that, Elise?
On this question?
Correct.
Yes, this question said individuals with prior law enforcement experience.
It didn't specify.
And if I could follow up to Lieutenant Hill, department's position that you are supportive of no Sbpd employees being able this COB, is that correct?
That's correct. No retired sworn law enforcement within.
Want to hear from Tammy?
Yeah. So I have to say that there is no data out there that any city has gathered that I know of where they have specifically figured out that this time frame means you have greater ability to be neutral or impartial in your decision making. I think that Lieutenant Hill makes a good point that a lot of it is about optics and the optics of relationship. And when I've worked with other cities who have struggled with the same question, a lot of times what does come up is that they're with time and distance from their career in law enforcement, that there tends to be perhaps the ability to look at things more impartially. But there's no scientific data to back any of that up. And when we do see timeframes for law enforcement that is able to be included in the oversight process, boards specifically, we normally see anywhere from 5 to 10 years. But again, those numbers are, because there isn't data to support why those are chosen, they could be seen as arbitrary by some.
Thank you, Cami. We also have Lewis here with us. Do you have an opinion on 5 to 10 years? How long have you been out of law enforcement?
First of all, yeah, I do have an opinion. I think I stated it before when I left Oklahoma. Maybe comments from this matter, and a member of Oakland community in the Bay Area and Houston. More time than I was a police officer. I think there are some unique positions that any law enforcement has, certainly. I don't think anyone, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone in here has had more run-ins with the police than one of the reasons I became that way was to try to. I couldn't. At around 1990, I left. There's perspective. I think in the small groups I've been in, I've shared that with as many people as I try to stay silent. My general feeling is most people probably don't want me on. Conclusion that I've felt my whole life, to be honest with you. How you
yes. Yes. In terms of, you've been out for a long time now, do you feel that having a certain amount of time away, like somebody should be retired, say 1 year, 2 years, years, 5 years, do you feel like that might be beneficial or no?
Yeah, I mean, just in wake of BLM and a lot of stuff that has gone on, nothing new to me, by the way. It might add in some more. It's been roughed up quite a few times. I think I understand both sides. I understand what it's like to go through academy, understand what it's like to be sworn in, trust, and understand when police officers do that, they, make, I experienced even a place like Oakland, which was wild at the time. Good ones are the best people you ever want to be with. The bad ones, and there was bad ones. Everyone looked bad. I'll go on the road and all of what you all have seen, we've all seen the last few years. A small percentage of not enough to make one bad cop that will make serving on juries, serving with some of you on cities here. I think understanding how police are trained. 21st century policing, but specifically, as Chief Malecki said, who is our police department is more important than anything, I think, our recommendations. And I was at a place that had 30, 40, 50 complaints a day. I've been in internal affairs, witness 18 times. I understand a good police that is, and I understand objectivity. I unbiasedly think we have a pretty good process in this. There's not a lot of complaints. I know that, I really think it's important that we rely on Attorney Drayton or whatever the internal affairs process. If we don't trust it, and I worked in a city for 6 years where people did not trust the police. How do I know that? They told me, obvious. That is a disaster for a community. You can't build relationships to have the trust, and that's what I'm for. Honestly, as a citizen now, I'm not a police officer. And there has to be a relationship building process for this to work. Lastly, I'll say defunding the police is not the answer. Specializing police, so many things, whether it's business profession code, penal code, vehicle code, being able to specialize, for example, for domestic violence. That far, it's not drugs, it's not murder, it's having officers that are trained or people that are trained to do that. Opposed to, as we know, homelessness is a big. Officers are expected to deal with all of those things.
No, it does, and I think just a follow-up though, as far as like if there is a role recommendations or like a compromise to be had, because again, this is contentious and we have new data. 61% are saying yes with some qualifications. The way that I read that was 58% are skeptical or unsure about how police should be on the board, right? So I'm saying with the larger portion of that being no. But I'm curious, like, if there is a date, period of time, like, what is your opinion on the number of years that you should be out of not serving a civilian, for that to be, to do the optics, to build the trust, to have the confidence of the public? Like, is it 5+ years? Is it 3 years? Is it really a distinction, or what would you say in your expert opinion?
Say it took 5 or 6 years to have some nightmares out of me, to be honest with you. And again, I worked in a different city. It was vastly different than here. I've only lived here since, and then I came from Houston and lived in the drastically different. my push for everyone in the group I was in is let's get to know our police department. Culture is of that culture in those cities, our city and country, is way different than the culture in my own studies, which I took to see what these officers, how they were trained, what they believed. They mind if I came in and looked at them, in which they didn't know who I was or what. I'm going to say, since you started with 5 years, I would say that I was going to say 10. Of it for a while and clear perspective, but
Can you maybe qualify that a little bit more too? Because that's some new information that I haven't heard. So the way you characterized it was nightmares, and I'm sorry for that. But I guess like what kind of things are you talking to there, if you don't mind me asking, that would help somebody like be able to be objective, to be to provide that expertise, but also to be further removed enough to be objective?
Well, wait, first of all, the work that you all have been really impressive. I met some really brilliant people. My perspective, first of all, I'm Black. My own experience is a bit more good, as I mentioned to you all. Change that, about trust, and I learned early on when I first went out on the street that I didn't know anything going on. I went to people living in the neighborhood and said, who's selling this, who's doing that? They knew. At least we thought we knew. We think we know, but we doing neighborhood watch meetings and in the community. And I know a lot of officers here can't. That's how I found out what was going on and what the people I was serving needed. I don't think police are any different than anybody in this room. This I came from was in major metropolitan areas. My personal opinion is our culture is good. Not perfect here. When I say, and the work we're doing, I think, is really good in here. Right. Don't trust police to do an investigation. We don't trust them to do that, which is what the vibe I've been getting in here. And for some problems, in my opinion, I live in the city. That's police to do an honest investigation on a. And I've looked at the types of. I officially, then we have a problem. Yeah. We have to trust that trained police officers can take statements. A big part. You don't see that part on TV, but a big part is writing crime report, taking statements, back up what you did. I'm not saying police don't ever always have told the truth, because we all. In order for this process to work, in my opinion, you have to know our police. I can tell you guys, the police officer, not a bad one. Those lights were violated. I saw people every day. That's what I mean by nightmare. I couldn't stop. I couldn't do anything about it. And the internal affairs at that time, that's the process, not very good. And there was no 21st century policing. It was just, and if you lived in Oakland and you didn't have any rights. That's just the way it was. I tracked in great discussions. But like how I felt is, I'm being excluded again from another place in my I mean, I'm not trying, probably not a good board anyway, but I think I know in order for this process to work, it has to be trust. The way to build that trust is to build the relationships. I don't know whether police certainly better like citizens, because that's who they're supposed to be. Yannick on that, I think I've been in the worst of the worst community. You guys, nightmares is a light word for it. My nose has been broken 6 times. I've been, average cop on where I've been is not the person on the street. And I think people would tell you in Oakland community that I know that came from, and Houston, if you don't have the trust,
No, thank you for sharing.
10 years, if that's what you want to hear. For me, I would say 10 years, but we're falling around 5 years. But
I just want to make a quick comment too, because I don't want to pass over something else that you really shared that I think is really important. I haven't felt welcome or that you have a voice on this. Because I feel like that often touted the diversity and like the fact that this commission is so special because we are that diverse. Like that's a failure on our part if any of the voices have felt like they haven't had a place. Like that we're now in person for the last like few meetings we have. And I thank you for being honest about that too. A couple more meetings to really have the most uncomfortable of the uncomfortable all year are going to be the next when we're really fighting on these things. So
thank you, Christian. Thanks for asking. I appreciate it. I haven't said much in my time. I didn't want to get in an argument with anybody. I'm just sharing what I think. And if it's voted differently, I think what I know. I know people in San Francisco, and their model is with citizens. I mean, it's a very interesting group that I've studied a little bit. Initially, it's the same thing I'm telling you. There was trust, and they didn't get to any good resolutions initially, according to what he. Well, they ended up trusting. He's also trusting. You can't trust somebody to do a basic investigation of a that's huge problematic in my opinion. We'd be way behind. You can't. I was looking at some of the plates that we get here, and attitudinal, some are very. The police, I get that. I've put up to many calls in Oakland with going here, blah blah. Why? Not in more languages in every language, but we used to learn how to issues and calm them down. That's what do, and that's what for any other city. We should trust. I think now, don't deserve the trust. That's another thing, but I can't see anything that says this police department doesn't deserve the public trust. I can. If you all can. And again, I'm coming from Houston and Oakland, so maybe those are. I think I heard Chief speak. There was, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it wasn't a lot of, not from where I come. That's just not a lot of complaints. And none of the complaints that I could see, sitting in Oakland when I was there, I got the crap beaten out of me. I had to go to the hospital first, then go to jail. I mean, that's every day. And 148 in this state, which is resisting arrest every day, all day. I haven't seen that here. I haven't seen that in LA. You see that people aren't just take me to the officer. It just doesn't work that way. Here, I think there is a lot of trust, a lot of good things to do. And how do we get trust? How do we understand what police do? We do. And that's only through an inclusionary process where people don't feel process.
Thank you so much for your input. It's given me a lot to think about. I don't know about the rest of you, but I think also while we're still have Elise here.
Wait, can we just because again, as you mentioned, that we can't just bypass that comment. The commission heard tonight from Commissioner Reynolds. We heard from last week, or the week prior from Chief Malekian, that comments made by commissioners, tones, microaggressions, or others have led to a feeling of lack of welcoming diverse experience, specifically related to law enforcement or former law enforcement. The importance of those statements are not lost on me, and I know I would like to personally apologize for that, because this is intended to be a collaborative process, and I'm hearing the message week after week that it has not been as collaborative as we had hoped. So for the next few weeks, I personally invite Commissioner Reynolds, Sergeant Hill, Chief Malekian to contribute to to contribute to the revision process as much as possible, and I invite you not to wait for us to invite, and with that, the commission to follow the lead of Commissioner Alonso in stopping for a moment to give that voice space in here, because we really do need we do need the perspective of law enforcement in these next few weeks for the revision process. So thank you, and I apologize.
Oh, no, thank you for even not saying it's. I don't want to argue my experience. I just want to share it with people, and as it needs to be weighed. That's what I've shared. So I'm just argue back with somebody. I'm not trying to debate anything or acknowledge anybody's experience in here. Argue what mine was, and that's.
Thank you for your input. I did have a follow-up question for Elise, but I've been taking up a lot of space here. So does anyone have questions? Okay, so bring up a really excellent point, I think, about trust, right? And so that's why I sort of highlighted some of these things at the beginning that were takeaways for me about the model as proposed. But if we could go to those slides specifically at the end of the presentation, Elise, about trust outcomes of internal investigations. There's it's like a series of I think 6 or 8 slides.
Are these the ones?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what you're saying, and I really resonated with what you're saying, which is that none of this works without trust, right? So this is some interesting data, right? And again, we talked about the limitations of this kind of survey, but here we have some interesting data, which is that 27% of people, right? So a third of people are saying, that there's no transparency, or that that they don't believe that there's transparency. And then the vast majority of people are saying, I don't know what to think. I don't actually know what the process is. And so there's 2 interesting takeaways from this for me that I want to think about for us, because we have, on the one hand, we have data that says that barring no changes to the existing process, a third of our community survey respondents, not the community, but the survey respondents, are saying there's no transparency or trust. And so when we have also folks looking at the recommendations that we've made and saying that would increase trust and transparency and accountability, I think that speaks to why we're here, right? Which is that oversight and inclusion of the community in the process is working towards that goal of reducing that number, right? Increasing the amount of people that are saying strongly agree or agree to more than a third of respondents. And also focusing on that top one, which to me is the probably more important one, which is that people don't know about the process at all. And I'm just wondering, Lieutenant Hill, if you sort of are looking at that the same way that I am, which is, like, what is the police department doing currently to, what is your takeaway from that data, first of all? That's my first question. And then secondly, what is the role of oversight in helping people understand, what the processes are, right? So that there is more understanding.
Let me start with the latter. I think that that's probably one of the most powerful parts of allowing for a vessel of it. And it takes a little bit of the any relationship, any historical anxieties, all those things that we know exist with the department. It allows for a kind of a new, or might even use the word space for people who want to. Department, the vast majority of how we engage with our confidential complaints, provide that in a database, because that's a so we do and share, contact and engage with people. That kind of says that all, which makes sense. Those that have engaged receive regular contact with, like, for example, they do get updated. Perhaps not as much as many want, but they do get updated in the process through communication via email or phone call, etc. What we're doing, like, for example, recently, our department is really trying to push out some more of that data. So, like, for example, recently, draft that had kind of summary of not only just crime data, but complaint data and stuff like that. So there's an effort also out in any of the platforms that we do have that people can go to. We can't make. I think that ensuring as a department that we use every platform we have, our social media, our website, relationships that we have in the community, push that data out. Like, for example, I can provide stuff like, simple infographics with some basic data to our nonprofit partners who have other relationships in the that's what we can do. I think that in the department and chief's position, that it's one of the most valuable tools of oversight is to help bridge that relationship with.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Because I think the slide that Elise had up specifically asked about trust and transparency of the internal investigation process. There are other questions where we talk about the complaint. Right? So are we, I know that, I think to that, in your answer, correct me if I'm wrong, you were kind of speaking to both, like how to communicate about what is the complaint process and how does someone who maybe get follow-up information about the status of their complaint. Then, I guess in thinking about the questions, there's a separate one that has to do with actually just the internal. Is that correct? There are two, the questions are getting at two separate things, one about complaint process and one about, at least you can maybe be the one to say that too.
You guys, those of you who are on the far end of the table, do cut out periodically for the phone. So it's,
great.
I'm sorry, maybe, no problem. Gabe, could you, or someone a little closer? I mean.
I can lean in, I guess.
Oh yeah, okay.
Is that better?
I think so.
Okay, I was just asking, I wanted to make sure I was thinking of it right, but also just to clarify that some questions, like the slide that you had up before you left and came back was, yeah, internal investigation process, but that is not the same as other questions where the language is specifically about the complaint process. Is there one where it is trust and transparency in the complaint process, or did we only use that language with internal investigation?
No, this is trust and transparency. This slide is trust and transparency in complaint process. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
I would say, to answer your question, is it part of our responsibility too? Because and honestly, had this not been the pandemic, I've gone to the academy and gone on a ride along, gone in the radio room, and gotten a chance to see what is the calls there. How do they prioritize their calls? How many calls to service officers are there on the street? Are they trained? But just knowing what our police department is, that's, I'm on the commission. What have you found out about the police? And share that with them. They having some type of town hall meeting there. I know for me, the neighborhood watch meeting, I don't know if they do them here. That was how I got to know. It wasn't always, gay police. After we got a relationship and they found out, hey, I want the same thing, if that's healing our community and seeing our community prosper, and that's through knowing that's about relationship. If police do not have positive relationships with that's a disaster. That's called community collaboration, and that's advocates of here. Start with us. What is our relationship with the police? We don't trust. I felt I didn't trust me, so I didn't want to use that as well.
Can I clarify again? Because you're saying like us and like our role. Do you also mean that to be the role of the Civilian Oversight Board that would get formed?
I mean, I just think because we've been here, with whatever title, and as the chief, had to know of you, and had we done some ride-alongs, gone to the academy, we couldn't because help us build that relationship. And when we go out, whether we're doing surveys or informal talks to people, I happen to work at a university with a basketball team. They don't understand sometimes. They walk in the room and understand why they're looked at funny. And had some candid conversations on here that I've observed, and spread that out through the community any way we can. I'm not saying that's our job, but we know these people. So, and I know Sergeant Drayton came and talked to our basketball team. Basketball team before. Excellent. And just to try to bridge those gaps, so it's great way we can.
I just want to make sure, I want to clarify that is also, because with this, to me, that means this is a very important part to make sure that in our recommendations, it's something that is, suggested, if not codified as what. The
average person is not going to understand citizens. How many people actually understand what the language they speak, and the law and areas I told you. Who even knows what that's like? And how can anybody listen to me here? I've said that's invaluable for us as commissioners, I think. And we have a better understanding, in my opinion, even of what, particularly as it pertains to our police department. And you could go out somewhere. I've been a ride along with other cities. And you can learn in 10 minutes that day there's something not right here. They're not. So I went through academy, and the first thing one of the FTOs told me, all that crap you learn in the academy, this is the real world. And yeah, that was times with this one, I couldn't wait to get out. How was our field training? I mean, I saw in Minnesota, I was an FTO. Crazy. How did he become an FTO? How did he transfer into that department? What was his record? How many shootings or altercations or internal affairs complaints did he have? And these are all things that I think we have our police department on. Whereas the average citizen is not going to be able to find other ways to get to know them. PAL. Do they have a PAL there? I don't know. That was a big way in Oakland through the athletics. I'm in a different light and helped a little bit.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing you say is that it goes both ways.
Absolutely.
And so I think, you know, in the spirit of collaboration too, I do have a question, again for you, Lieutenant Hill. Commissioner Rachel Johnson had asked in our meeting 2 weeks ago on the 23rd, she had asked Chief Malekian if this data, this new data from the survey, would essentially influence the department's position that the model as proposed with the Office of Police Oversight, they're in opposition to it. So I'm just, and you don't have to like give us a, you know, full, you know, response on behalf of the police department tonight, but I am sort of curious about what is your reaction to, and again, we talked about the limitations, we have to acknowledge the limitations of this data, but what was your reaction to a majority of respondents saying that the model as proposed would increase trust, transparency, and accountability?
I think any form of committee input, acknowledge the people that took the time to provide this input. A lot of questions that still need to come out, and I think this is what's about is a preliminary presentation, and I think that perhaps the longer form memo or provide a little bit more background and context, because there's still some questions, to be quite honest, that I would have. Like, for example, I'm still trying to determine whether we know how many people live and work in the city, whether outside jurisdiction. I could see that some of the respondents clearly don't live in the city, live in other. So things like that, I think I'd be interested in knowing. I think our chief would be interested before the an opinion. And honestly, the chief will need to speak whether it influences, but it's certainly helpful. But again, this is a preliminary. There's some preliminary data, and even the language I've heard describing some of what I see on the slides is. I think more information would be good. I'm looking forward to reading along. I guess I would say that and how it may or may not. After he sees the work done and any of the commission will. I don't know if that gives you your answer, but I think right now the report.
Absolutely.
But
I would just say
very appreciative of the feedback from the community as always, because we get a lot of feedback from the community. We don't often get something like this.
Yeah, and I think this is a huge value to come out of this process to be able to gather this kind of data too. And I would just say, you know, on behalf of myself and hopefully the other commissioners as well, that we're interested in what you think about the aggregate data, and we'd like to hear your perspective on that.
and any questions that you have that are unclear. That's it for me. Sorry, all.
That was really great, and I want to follow up. Like, have questions right now that we could, while Lisa's here, we direct them to her so that if it's not in the memo, it could get clarified in the.
Yeah, and again, I really appreciate the contribution that was made to this. I think the one question, honestly, I would have now, but I don't want to take up space before there's a final report, because I know she's already made very clear there's a lot more information, is will CCI be able to, how many respondents live and work in the city versus the broader Santa Barbara community or Isla Vista that have their own different jurisdictions. Part of the influence that this information might have on our department might be more meaningful if it was from our specific, or our community that we jurisdictions. That would be the one question I would have right now. I'm not sure if it can be answered or not, but other than that, I think I'd like to hold CCI has a chance to really provide more robust data.
No, we're not going to. That is what I was trying to explain, perhaps poorly, about the way the select all option here means that these are neighborhoods that respondents identified as having worked or resided within, but we have no way to verify that beyond what they report.
But I think it, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, I realized that was what I was thinking when Lieutenant Hill, you asked that question, is that exactly that, like, we self-reporting demographic information, we can't tell you that, but, you know, we also can't say that that person used to live in Goleta, but does in fact live downtown, right? Like, I don't know if we can claim any conclusive things based on this demographic. But, I mean, the question I would contribute, and I feel like this is a discussion for the commission that we'll have to have, is like, really, does that matter? Like, if I live in Nolita, but I work at Santa Barbara City College, I am still a stakeholder of Sbpd. They work, right? Like, so does that mean I'm not in the jurisdiction of Sbpd? It definitely does, right? I'm 8 to 10 hours of my day there, and in, well, for law enforcement, it would be the sheriffs that respond. So, I mean, I feel like that's, I mean, the whole year of this, we started out by saying, like, our purview is not the sheriffs, our purview is not the sheriffs, but ultimately, people's experience of law enforcement, they get pulled over, how many people think, like, was that CHP, or was that a sheriff's car, or was that a, right? Like, I think I understand why Sbpd wants to know that, but I also feel like it is impossible for anything other than a rigorously scientific, non-anonymous, verified survey could ever tell. Verify residential addresses. I mean, budget-wise, we could never, that survey would never get paid for. But also, I mean, like, that was, like, it's just so far beyond our purview, but I still feel like we have to have that conversation.
If I can just clarify, Commissioner Johnson, I hope I didn't misspeak, but I did, that was inclusive of live our work. Live our work is something that we, if they live our work. Definitely.
Third question, discussion item.
I just want to bring up one thing, because this is something that jumped out at me, and I really want to think more through it, but I also recognize, I will say it. The question, Elise, if you want to go back to the slide on the complaints, like how folks self-identify their experience directly with the complaint process.
This one?
Because this is really interesting, right? Like this, yeah, that one. So this is a question, actually, that Chief Malekian proposed to us that we included at the request of the chief. And so as this came up, I think, a few meetings ago when we had Joey from Boulder present to us, and also related to the chief's memo of staffing, right? Like how much time do we need dedicated to things? And so the number of complaints complaints come up as a reason why maybe we don't need as much, or that the oversight board rather wouldn't, or that wouldn't have enough to do. I think without summarizing Boulder's experience, which I think Phil indicated, there was always plenty to do. This to me is really interesting because though we cannot claim that 7%, 60-something people who last year might have filed a complaint, it's still interesting to consider that there's a lot of folks that didn't know a process was available to them, considered filing a complaint, but process, or that 1% that attempted to file. So I don't know, this slide is interesting, right? Because 3% said they have filed a complaint. And if that's of 1,000 people, that is more than kind of, it's certainly more than what last year's data showed. So obviously this is people at any point in their life have filed with Sbpd, but I mean, to me, this is also interesting. Like, I'm thinking through what is the support that the board would need if we are linking staff support to handling a certain number of things. So I just wanted to point to that one, that's the one I'm going to be for. And Elise, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's appropriate data-wise that we can't claim any time or actual numbers based on these percentages.
You mean a time frame within when the complaints? No, this is just essentially exactly as asked. Have you ever filed?
Was there any qualitative or open text box field stuff related to any of this that comes to mind, or that we might see in the full report? Limited. I think there was only, that I can remember off the top of my head, only one focus group participant identified as having been through the complaint process. So there's not a lot of additional data on people's personal experiences.
Questions? Definitely want to thank Lewis for hoping that we can provide I feel welcome in doing it. Hill, thank you for any other memo. Thank you, Elise, all of your hard work. And this was a big lift again. Really interested to see that. If folks have questions about the memo, is it okay for them to reach out to you directly? Do you want them to go through the focus working group?
No, they can reach out directly. It's however you would prefer to do it is perfectly fine with us.
Perfect. So I will share the presentation from tonight with everyone, and then also the memo. Once she sends it over, I'll send. If you have any questions, so. Yeah.
You also, maybe when we get the memo, I know it's on our website, like it was posted, but also maybe the focus group document that had the focus group questions, right?
Yeah.
So folks can have also like, here's.
I'll include the protocols for both.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you to the again, I know you already said this, but thank you so much, Elise, and for your, I mean, the fact that we got this much in a month is just blowing my mind. Like, I don't know if, sorry for the constraints.
No, I mean, I will say, I think this was a really, there's a lot of very useful information here. And I know, you know, people in an ideal world, it might be more, you know, extrapolatable to a larger, you know, the city as a whole, or there might be, more, but I think this is a great number for the time period that we have. And there's a lot of good content here that hopefully will be useful for you.
All right, well, with that, close out the item. We did public comment. So we'll close out this item. There are no other items for tonight. Before we go, I did want to encourage you, and Cami, if you want to come on and give a little bit more context, it would be helpful if everyone looked over the recommendations before Wednesday's meeting. Come to the meeting with specific items that you want to discuss with the and then from that meeting to the next meeting, Cami is going to use that feedback to draft up some proposed language, hopefully so that we could approve the recommendations next Wednesday. Cami, was that?
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. The only thing I'd add is if there are specific sections that you believe that you'd like to talk about, if you want to send those to me individually, just so I can have that section of the recommendations pulled up. That doesn't mean that if you don't send it to me, we can't talk about it. But as streamlined as we can make the conversation, I think that will help us and give us more time for those things that just happen to come up later on in the conversation. Because really, we want to talk about all of the things that you might want to change or adjust, and the things that you'd like to keep as is on Wednesday. And as Gabe said, then we'll bring back additional language to you for final adoption the following Wednesday.
I have a question on that. I thought we were forming a work group to do that drafting.
It's such a quick turnaround, it's probably better.
And I feel like, I remember we did talk about that, but with the, timeline, I feel like it also feels better that the whole commission is the final working group, right? Like, having something that Cami drafts more inclusive, I guess.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm only getting about 5 words at a time, and then I'm missing 5 words.
I was just commenting. I thought that in the last meeting we had talked about forming a work group to do the draft revisions, and I feel like, I don't know, I think it would feel differently if it was discussed that it was going to be changed as opposed to just announced that it was changed. So I'm just feeling a little.
I did mention it last meeting. That's making it work. If it was more clear. Okay, I think that's it, and so we will call this meeting adjourned at 7:47.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Elise.